Hello and welcome to ICA in Conversation that broadcasts on the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month, focusing on current issues and challenges in the context of compliance and counter-financial crime. I'm Tim Tyler, and coming up, we're going to consider how technology both contributes to the hyper levels of uncertainty and volatility across the world, and how it can help us to navigate through them. This, of course, is the second in a two-part series that considers how we as compliance professionals navigate through a changing world order. You may remember that the first part, 2 weeks ago, in which I spoke to Sian Dalrymple about the role of leadership in this context. Today, we're thinking about technology, though, and to do this, I'm delighted to be joined by Jane G. Jane has an extraordinary career working in the context of counter-financial crime. A barrister who has a particular interest in the complex and changing world of payment services and has held a variety of director, board and company secretary roles, as well as serving on payments-related working groups. Jane, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you very much for your time. As ever, we would love to hear from you wherever you are in the world. It's always fascinating when people add in the comments where they're joining us from. And already I can see reference to India, Barbados, Alabama and Kuala Lumpur. So thank you for sharing that insight. But it's also an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you may have or add any observations that you have. And ordinarily, we'll speak for just about 20 minutes on the subject, and then we'll keep the last 10 or so minutes as an opportunity to respond to whatever questions or observations you may ask. So let's jump straight in. And can I ask, Jane, how do you see technology? Do you see it as the problem or the cure in the context of compliance in today's volatile world order?
I don't see it as an either or, Tim. I see it as a both. Technology is both part of the problem and undoubtedly part of the solution. I think that when one considers these days, technology is being used by criminals to carry out all sorts of financial crime, social media manipulation, deep fakes, account takeovers. There's a whole list, identity theft, you name it. Criminals will find a way to exploit systems. And I don't think there's any choice. We don't have any choice as compliance professionals, but to use technology to counter their use of technology. And I think it's very interesting. Organized criminal gangs operate like a big business these days, don't they? They have divisions for drug dealing, human trafficking, lots of, they'll exploit any system. They'll even exploit getting licensed as waste disposal companies and then dumping things on the side of the road. They are skilled at learning where there are gaps in our systems and where they can be exploited. And therefore, we don't have any choice. AI is just the latest form of technology which they're using and which we will be using increasingly to counter them.
There's so much I think we could unpack in what you've just said. So let's first of all just think about the criminal threat for a moment. You've touched on the way in which criminals, for instance, are creating synthetic identities or taking over people's identities. You've touched on AI. We could go further, of course. We could look at the way in which ChatGPT has been jailbroken and is being used quite routinely for fraud, exploitation, for anarchic behavior, for romance fraud in particular. We could go further in terms of the wider use of AI in generating synthetic identities. But you've also touched on the fact that criminals are incredibly creative, exploitative, My experience when I was investigating financial crime, again and again, I looked at a fraudster and I thought, if you went straight, you could be really good because you're very innovative, very clever, very astute in the approach that you take. You've seen this firsthand then over a number of years.
I certainly have, and I agree with you up to a point. I think there are very criminals will employ very clever people. I think what's quite sad is that, as you say, those clever people could be force for good or harm. And I don't think it's the criminals themselves necessarily. There are an awful lot of criminals who are just the foot soldiers in these scams, particularly when you look at some of the ways that there are warehouses full of people who are under duress and who are forced to carry out phishing attacks and things of that nature. So I think you really need to, we do need to fight fire with fire, I'm afraid. That is the situation we're in. We absolutely don't have any choice. And criminal activity, when you think about recent things that we've seen in the press, we've seen Marks and Spencer's was attacked, £750 million wiped off their share price in the original day of the attack. We've seen Land Rover, Jaguar Land Rover, who have stopped production because of their attack. They are losing millions of pounds a day. Their 33,000 staff have been told to stay at home. Just think of the levels of disruption that cyber-enabled crime causes, and the loss, not just the loss to businesses and to the economy and to individuals as well. So it's right across the piece. So I think when you think of that level of harm, then you also realise that we have got to react and we've got to use the technology we can to counter it.
It's interesting. There's a parallel here, isn't there? In the context of organised crime, network type crime, we've often in the past talked about the need for a network to fight a network. So a network of banks, public-private partnerships and the like. Here, we're talking about the need for the right technology to counter the criminal use of technology. And there are parallels, I think, between the two. Can I just, if I may, just step back for a moment, though? We're thinking about the impact of technology into the volatile context for which compliance professionals are currently working. You've talked about the criminal use of technology. I wonder whether there's a wider aspect to this, though. So part of the role of a compliance professional, of course, is regulatory, and it's around good governance. It's about managing risk. And of course, some of that's going to relate to financial crime, but there's going to be a wider risk generated by or linked to the use of technology. Whether that's, I know, something that's close to your heart in the payments ecosystem. And we were talking the other day about the way in which that's moved from slow time to quick time to real time payments across national boundaries and so on. That, for instance, generates a different profile of risk. Looking at it in terms of deployment of AI, again, that generates a very different set of risks to a business as they are incorporating this within there. Is that a fair description, or would you challenge that?
Oh, I think it's a fair description, but as you may know, I worked in payments for a lot of my career, and I'm the lead at the Payments Association Working Group on Financial Crime. The Payments Association has just published a very interesting paper in response to the government's payments vision, national payments vision, called Making Britain a Payments Powerhouse. And that paper is, describing a number of the issues that are now facing all of us. When you're saying, AI is being used, it certainly is. And when you think of payments, I would say it's important. We talk about frictionless payments and we talk about how important speed is. And that is the case quite often. But it may be that we need to stop and think, and that bigger payments may need to take a bit longer. we may need to introduce some friction into the payments process in order to stop criminal activity. I'm quite close to the APPR policy, which the PSR has put in place. And I feel that it's good that consumers are getting reimbursed, but I also think that that policy hasn't been directed enough towards the prevention of financial crime and prevention of those authorised push payment frauds that are taking place. And again, criminals are getting cleverer in terms of their ways of approaching that criminal activity. Many of them will, in a romance fraud context, as you know, will spend a great deal of time and effort, invest a great deal of time and effort in setting up their scam before it actually takes place. And it seems as though, with all the warnings that people are given, that they still are subject to those sorts of scams, which I think is quite sad. So I think the education of people is part of the answer, but it can't be the whole answer. There has to be methods of protecting people from these scams. And, when it comes to good governance, I think it's a structure that you're looking at that needs to take account of the technology that's available. I think the governance is where you start, but those details of the latest scams are where you have to also place some emphasis.
It's a really good example that you've given around. You mentioned APP, of course. That's as you said, authorized push payment fraud. This is where a customer of a bank or a financial institution will willingly give money to essentially a fraudster. They're being ripped off. At the time, they don't know they're being ripped off, and they voluntarily provide the money to that individual or to that company. And you touched on some of the ways in which we can mitigate this. And it creates a little bit of friction, doesn't it? In the payment process, you sort of slow down. You're being asked, before you press go, do you know this individual? Are you confident in the business relationship, and so on? And that's a good example of the use of technology. Are there other things going on behind the scenes, though, in terms of transaction monitoring, screening, and other ways in which payment providers and banks and the like are screening the movement of funds to try and mitigate the risk of fraud?
There are, and there's lots of providers of those kinds of services, Tim. I also work with Numitor, which is a data analytics company. They actually help various police forces with the analysis of data, because once you bring data from different sources together, you get a much more complete picture. Their software, SpiderSense, is being used by Graham Barrow and Ray Blake at Risk Alert 247. And Risk Alert 247 is working with banks at the moment to explain that this company that you're looking at, which was formed last week, there were 50 other companies formed with the same pattern of SIC codes. That's the code which is used to describe the type of company you're setting up, or in the same street, and or with some similar directors. And if you don't have access to the right data like that, you can't really calculate the risk. And so technology is enabling us to bring, when we talk about large language models and big data, what we're really talking about is having the right information to make the right decision. And it is a heavy burden on compliance people to determine where they get that data from, and how they handle it, and whether it's going to have privacy concerns and all of that regulatory burden that is also placed on them. It's not easy, but it's important, and it has to be done.
So there are a number of different worlds that collide in the context of what you've just described. You've got the incredible gazillion bytes of data that are out there. I think the zettabytes actually is probably a little bit less childish as a way of describing it, but zettabytes of data available to be interrogated across the internet, huge amounts of data unique to our customers that are being interrogated, systems that allow us to do that. Now, we've also got, and you touched upon the importance of governance around how we're handling and using that data, and there are, of course, regulatory requirements and constraints around that. There's regulatory interest in this, and separate from all of this, you've got the victim or the potential victim, your customer, and law enforcement interest sitting in the background, very often around potential crimes that's taking place. We could probably go on, but there's a lot of complexity within what may be a very simple thing, a transaction that's going to take place between two individuals. Actually scratch the surface, and there's a lot more going on beneath.
Absolutely right, Tim. And of course, it's having the right information which will enable you to determine that. So with transaction monitoring, even if you've got a criminal that you've let in and are onboarded, transaction monitoring can be the method by which you determine that there are issues. Because I mean, I'm quite sure, going back to the Fowler Oldfield case, if you remember, with NatWest, that Fowler Oldfield said that they weren't going to be there wouldn't be cash transactions, and then there were. There were a lot of mistakes that were made in relation to that, and hopefully that's an example which is long since been rectified by all the banks. But these data breaches, you have to remember that criminals will use the data that they've obtained through a data breach to use identities of those individuals to be directors of companies that they can then use. And when you're talking about how many people we've got from different countries listening now, criminals, as we know, have no borders, don't recognize any kind of geographical limits. And we are moving towards a situation where there is more global collaboration, which will be facilitated by technology, and should be. I mean, personally, I think that we should be now, the FCA should think about compulsory data sharing. I'm involved with Pay.UK's enhanced data exchange, which is gradually being consulted on, and in fact the consultation for that ends quite soon. But even though we have these initiatives, they are moving rather slowly compared to the way in which criminals are operating, and they really should be moving in a much faster direction.
And this, of course, isn't unusual. I mean, you just need to look at the Financial Action Task Force. When did it last fundamentally overview its core standards and recommendations, the 40 recommendations? Well, that wasn't as long ago as 2012. I mean, a great example of, in some respects, a glacial speed. But of course, in fairness to them, they're driven by consensus, and there's politics around this, and it's a challenging environment to work in. Before we move to some really interesting observations and questions that have been raised, can I just pick up on something else that we spoke about in preparation for this discussion? And that is, as we were thinking about the geopolitical challenges going on around us, you reflected on US policy changing around, in particular, transparency of corporate entities. And of course, that's quite topical. President Trump was addressing the United Nations yesterday, and being, I shouldn't be saying this, shouldn't be talking about elevators and staircases and teleprompters, and all of it seemed to go wrong for him. But on a more serious level, he, of course, represents a very different way of looking at some of these challenges. And I think you touched on the fact that here we are, we're presented now with a different set of requirements. We don't have the transparency that we were looking for. And we need to be innovative in our use of technology, amongst other things, in a way to find our way through that. I don't know if that's a fair summary of your observation.
It is, but I think there are some glimmers of hope. Because I think that if you look at the speech that was made by, I think it's John Hurley, talking about what the strategy that the US could adopt in relation to anti-money laundering. And there's now some proposals which we're looking at, and LinkedIn has a number of different posts about his speech, which I think was yesterday or the day before, which is saying we need to do more and we can do more, and here's how we're going to go about it. So I don't think we should be pessimistic. Even though the Bank Secrecy Act and things haven't come to the position that we wanted them to, we need to see that there are still plenty of people who do take this whole financial crime situation and remedying what they can do very seriously, particularly in the US. And that global cooperation is going to be the thing which we need. We can't do any of this as a single country. We have got to combine, because that's the way criminals operate. As I said, cross-border, they don't think anything of those geographical boundaries.
And that takes us back to, we need a network to fight a network. But if I can segue into, we need technology to fight the way in which criminals are using technology. Do you see technology as having an important role in countering financial crime that abuses corporate structures, that hides assets, hides ownership, effectively launders value in a way that is very difficult to determine and understand, because companies can be set up in such a way, historically, in such a way that the ownership and control of them is opaque?
Yes, Tim, you're right. I do follow Dan Needle, who founded Tax Policy Associates, and Dan is increasingly showing that there are companies who've registered at Companies House and filed documents which have the same accounts, which are maybe 1 pence different year on year, which is almost impossible. Graham Barrows also talked about that. And I think you're seeing figures now. We've seen companies formed with a share capital which is greater than the entire GDP of the world. There are crazy situations. Companies House is being reformed because of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, and we should all be grateful and look forward to those reforms. And we're about to all have to verify ourselves as directors, for example, but that's only going to be as good as banks' verification of people as well, isn't it? It's not going to be until we have a proper digital ID system, which we don't have yet. That's not going to make that much difference. But some of the other reforms from Companies House, gradually, they will see, for example, comparing accounts. It will be technology that will enable that analysis of data. And they will begin to see that there are things going on which are not right and which need further investigation. And I don't doubt that will come in due course. But it's, again, as I said, somewhat of a slow road to get there, unfortunately.
And on the subject of digital identification, I think earlier on today you shared on LinkedIn a speech or an article written by William Hague on this subject. So there is an ongoing. William Hague for those outside of the UK, is a prominent. I think he's a former MP now. He's no longer serving, but he was leader of the Conservative Party and one of our thought leaders in British politics at the moment. And he obviously is advocating for this. But as we look around the world, the picture changes a little, although I think it's fair to say that there has been a drive over the last 5-10 years towards greater transparency, underpinned by G7, G8 as it was, FATF and other United Nations and other multilateral organizations that have been pressing, arguing, facilitating change so that we know who owns a company, who controls it. But coming back to your point, if I may, you I think if I understand you correctly, you were saying, well, in some instances, we don't have that transparency. It's not there on tap. If we go to the register, it's not immediately obvious who owns or controls the entity, whether that's in the UK or the British Virgin Islands or wherever it is in the world. But there are things that we can do that will help us to determine whether there's a criminal element to what's going on. So you gave some examples of, we can look at the ownership, we can look at the registered address, we can look at the directors, we can look at the share capital. And in doing that across perhaps a number of companies, we can look for patterns that are strongly indicative of something not being quite right, at the very least. And that becomes a starting point. And if you know that your customer is displaying certain behaviors as a corporate entity that don't make sense, well, you go further, you ask more questions, and you do your due diligence. Again, have I characterized that fairly, Jane? Or?
You have, Tim. I think the pity is that Companies House is now going out with a survey to ask companies, well, what's the value of our data? How do you use it, and what's the value? Just imagine if the register, instead of being a passive register, which just people could just apply to and anyone could pay their £50 and form a company, if it actually were a register of accuracy and truth. I mean, imagine the money that could be saved by financial institutions if the register was something they could really just rely on in itself. It could be completely transformative. And I'm not saying, I know they're working towards having more accuracy, but they're nowhere near there yet. And there are still, again, companies quite often selling on Amazon or Temu who are using stolen VAT numbers. They are deceiving people. They are not paying any VAT. So they're doing no good to the economy. And again, I mean, I now look quite carefully at who I buy items from, whichever platform I'm using. And it is things that individuals can do. But again, we need more action and more enforcement. And I know it's not easy for the government, who have got this massive growth agenda, to tackle these abuses by very large tech platforms. But in the end, that is what we need to happen. And we need them to be involved, not just financial institutions who are the guardians and the, if you like, the defense against financial crime. It needs to be all companies. So things are moving in the right direction, but not perhaps moving as quickly as they could and should.
I think that's a great summary. Thank you. I've got time to just reflect on one or two observations and questions that have been raised through the comments. So my thanks to Nigel Pierre for a number of observations, Nigel, and in particular, where you reflect that the criminals have time and they're not limited by constraints. They aren't limited by values, and their motivation is around money. And we, if you like, on the other side of the fence, have none of those things, arguably. We don't have a great deal of money. We certainly don't have an awful lot of time. And quite rightly, we're constrained by values and other protection issues. I think that's quite a clever and insightful thought. Jane, feel free to jump in, but I've got one or two other observations.
If I could just say one thing, and that is, of course, data privacy is, people are always concerned about their privacy. Personally, I'm very glad to see that the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act gave us the opportunity to say we are sharing data because we are trying to detect or prevent financial crime. And it's about time that is being used more broadly by banks, who are telling their legal advisors, look, I have got this specific permission to do this, and I should be doing it. So I think, again, people are feeling more empowered. We have got a lot of restrictions. Some of those restrictions are quite right. We don't want to live in a police state, but we do want to be able to fight this scourge of crime and fraud, which is now affecting so many people and so seriously. You can't really turn on the radio or the television without another scam program telling you what's been going on. And so I think that we are we should recognise that some of the restrictions we've had maybe not be appropriate anymore because we live in a different environment.
And maybe there's option or an opportunity for wider debate, public debate around some of these balances, because they're fine balances, aren't they? And can I, just for the benefit of people outside of the UK, just reflect on your description in terms of the recent legislation that's opening up a gateway for the exchange of information. Now, that information typically between banks, financial services, where there is a concern about possible money laundering or terrorist financing, then this operates as a legal gateway, so they can share that in a controlled way with either other banks or with public sector, with the police, with law enforcement. So it's public to public or private to public and private to private exchanges. Now, outside of the UK, there are very similar provisions and arrangements going on in many different jurisdictions: Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, the United States, under the Patriot Act, and many other provisions that allow this kind of exchange of information. And I think the key thing, Jane, if you agree, is that there is a control around this so that it's facilitated, but facilitated in a way that's responsible and proportionate.
I completely agree, Tim. But unfortunately, the way that this is happening at the moment is that there are lots of proof of concepts and lots of activities, but there isn't enough leadership, to come back to your last in conversation, because you've got great work being done by Stop Scams, who've proved that the whole ecosystem approach is the right one, i.e. not just financial institutions, but telcos and social media companies. And you've got great work being done in Singapore and Australia, who have also shown that that approach is the right one. But we are in a situation where, as I said to you, the enhanced data exchange from pay.uk, they are consulting on, and I think that will only be a very limited way of exchanging information. It won't be as broad as we need it to be. And we are looking at technology to help us with that data exchange. We're looking for good governance of it, and we're looking for the right kind of technology. We're also in that situation where standards and a common API standard will make a difference, because we're moving into open banking and open finance. And again, those are going to be technology enabled activities. So we need to keep abreast of all of that. I do think that leadership in this field is absolutely crucial, and it's got to be coming from, Home Office, Treasury and the FCA, as well as Bank of England and the other regulators.
And that, I think, is a nice way to close, by bringing us back to the role of technology in managing the complexity around us. So over the last 30 minutes, we've thought about the way in which criminals are exploiting and using technology against us, the opportunity that we have to push back and, where necessary, use technology in realizing that. We've talked about corporate transparency, sharing information arrangements, public-private partnerships. We've talked about payment provision and the way that that is changing at the moment. And again, that's technology enabled, but also recognize the need for leadership around the change that's going on around us. And I think I agree that leadership needs to be at every level, politically, policy level, but also I think within organizations, having the courage to make the right decisions and not necessarily just the expedient ones. So Jane, can I thank you once again for joining me for a fascinating conversation? And wherever you're joining us today or from around the world, can I thank you for doing so, for your interest and engagement, and for those that have shared their thoughts on the comments section. Really interesting to see your views being shared in that way. But for the moment, we'll bring this to a close. Once again, my thanks to Jane, and do take care, everyone, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jim.